magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and in this video, I'll be talking about which Craftworld's list archetypes are currently performing best in the late 9th edition meta. I'll discuss 3 or 4 different types of lists that account for nearly all of the Craftworld's rosters that have made it to the last 8 of a grand tournament since Arcs of Omen dropped, and how those archetypes might inform your own roster building. I'm obviously not suggesting that you should focus your efforts on making lists more competitive. There are lots of ways to enjoy the hobby, and I certainly enjoy both narrative and competitive play myself. But for those of you trying to unlock the puzzle of tournament play, or merely to add some teeth to a casual army that needs a boost, I'm hoping that a rundown of what has worked well for Space Elves at the top tables at major events will have some value. I might in the coming weeks invite some top players on the channel to discuss specific versions of these lists, but today's video is just a general overview, not a deep dive on the nitty-gritty of how to play any particular build. This video is actually replacing 2 that I had announced in my Farseers report earlier this year, one on list construction generally and another on primary objective scoring. Since posting that Farseers report, I have become convinced that 10th edition 40k is actually right around the corner. I was a doubter when I made that video, but at this point, the evidence online is pretty substantial. It may only be 3 or 4 months away. And so Arcs and Omen is probably the final chapter approved of 9th edition. And if the rumors are true, the 10th edition core book will drop alongside a complete set of indexes, mini temporary codexes for every faction, replacing all 9th edition books. And as such, it makes sense to delay videos on core principles of scoring and list building based on current rules. Foundational videos like the one that I was planning probably wouldn't continue to be relevant for very long. So I'm going to kick that back. Instead, we're going to talk about what all of the successful Arcs of Omen elf lists have in common, what's working now, and I think that should get everybody to summer, because I don't think that anything in this video is going to become irrelevant between now and the end of the edition. What all of these lists do have in common, these lists that are doing well, is that they are hyper aggressive. Just as predicted back when Chapter Approved dropped, Craftworlds can no longer win games by keeping their heads down and controlling their own half of the table. But also, now that Armor of Contempt is gone, CWE, that's Craftworld Eldar for you newbies, once again have the killing power without Armor of Contempt to wipe the floor with just about any target at close to medium range. So our ability to reliably delete enemy units at close-ish range has gone way up again, and because elves are not durable enough to hold objectives out in the open against intact enemy forces, and because most of the passive secondary scoring options that we were using vanished in the new Chapter Approved, ambitious autarchs looking to perform well in competitive play must engage in a high casualty trading game that involves getting up close and personal with an opponent to score big on primaries in the last 2 turns when there's not a whole heck of a lot left on the table. Ideally, just not a whole heck of a lot of your opponent's units. In nearly all cases, if you're playing competitively, this means taking the secondaries behind enemy lines, warp ritual, and scout the enemy, occasionally swapping one of those out for a matchup-specific killing option, in some cases Wrath of Cain. Very occasionally banners, raise banners, takes the place of scout the enemy. But in general, we're working with this narrow band of secondaries. That's really what's competitive for Eldar at the moment. In all cases, these lists include units that can be in the opponent's backfield on turn 1 for behind enemy lines, so that's kind of non-negotiable, and also to apply early game pressure. Some lists are using striking scorpions to accomplish this. Others use cheap disposable vipers or other cheap bike units. Some have some howling banshees that jump out of a transport 3 inches and then advance and charge with fate dice. A few make use of Harlequin allies. There are a lot of ways to do this, right? But every top list since Arcs of Omen dropped has some way of achieving that that first turn behind enemy lines scoring. And another curious commonality between all Arcs of Omen top 8 lists. When I say all Arcs of Omen, I'm talking about the ones that make it to the top tables. all of them have had at least one Phoenix Lord. Now, usually this is Bahareth, but shockingly, pretty much everybody is represented. Sometimes Ozerman makes it in there for durable objective control. He's really good at medium range and close range, but occasionally they're total outlier picks. There was a top list that included Jane Czar, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, which made me really happy. In the most unlikely tag-along of all, Mogan Ra made it into one. The durable OBSEC provided by Phoenix Lords is invaluable in the high-casualty, high-pressure way of playing Space Elves that's currently dominating our section of the meta. I think, though, that the variation in unit selection that we're seeing with the Phoenix Lords matches a sort of broader variation in unit selection, which I found totally gratifying about the performance of Craftworlds these past couple of months, because despite the fact that all of the successful rosters have favored a very similar overall play style instead of secondary missions, it's not as though there are like two very specific Craftworld builds that are the builds to beat. There are several units that show up again and again as essential cornerstones of successful lists, but there have been so many outliers. One recent top GT list even included an MSU unit of fire dragons to help cinch Wrath of Cain, and I think that might even have been a Hail of Doom list. I'd have to check, but to the best of my knowledge, dragons haven't been seen on the top table at a major tournament in literally years. So it's great that in the twilight months of 9th edition, we're seeing that it's a fertile time for previously benched units to get a little play time, even if the overall play style is pretty specific. To put it another way, building successful lists for CWE at the moment is not a matter of spamming 4 or 5 overpowered units. And that's occasionally been true in previous editions. Think Reapers back at the beginning of 8th with the Ynnari rules, which is why Reapers are still in the penalty box and still don't have good rules, as they made so many people angry at the beginning of 8th Ed, rightfully so. Instead, successful autarchs are the ones who have worked out how to construct. But so instead of unit spamming, right, those of us who are doing reasonably well in competitive play, people who have worked out how to construct and pilot a roster that can out-trade an opponent while leaning into the secondaries that I mentioned earlier, those are the lists and play styles that are doing best. So even in a tight matchup against another skilled opponent with a good list, these Craftworlds rosters can usually reliably score in the 80s if they're run well. Against a less skillful opponent or in an advantageous matchup where your opponent just... Marines have a hard time, except for Blood Angels, freaking Blood Angels. Many Marines have a hard time playing into Craftworlds. Sometimes in those very advantageous matchups, these lists, well run, can score in the mid-90s. It's pretty hard to get to 100 with CWE, but you can get a pretty good score in the 90s. And there are lots of ways to build for those outcomes. Ultimately, the real question is how you personally prefer to maximize the damage output of hyper-aggressive murder elves. And there are a bunch of different ways to do that. So we're going to go into those different list archetypes that have been doing well. The first and by far the most common winning list archetype is Hail of Doom. Hail of Doom lists have accounted for more top Craftworlds finishes since the new chapter approved dropped, probably than every other sub-faction build combined. For you very new players, Hail of Doom is a custom Craftworld trait that allows shuriken weapons to auto-wound on 6s to hit and count as 6s to wound, triggering the additional -2 AP on the shuriken ability. Despite what it says in the actual codex, Hail of Doom was FAQ'd last year to take up both custom Craftworld slots, such that if you select this bonus, you may not select another. Nevertheless, it remains one of the most powerful sub-faction picks in the game, especially now that Armor of Contempt is gone. Hail lists capitalize on powers like Guide and Doom to turn high-volume shuriken fire into the most versatile target elimination tool maybe in the entirety of 40k, especially when combined with Blade Storm, a stratagem that causes 6s to hit on shuriken weapons to score 2 hits instead of 1. A unit of 10 Dire Avengers at only 130 points in a Hail of Doom list can easily wipe out the majority of infantry squads in a single volley. If you drop Guide on them and pop Blade Storm for exploding 6s and start by re-rolling everything that's not a 6, 10 Dire Avengers can kill or cripple targets that would normally be way above their pay grade. So even Toughness 8 tanks and monsters wither before this storm of souped up shuriken fire. Add to that the Avengers can then battle focus out of line of sight, and it's no surprise that 3 units of Dire Avengers is a staple in every Hail of Doom list that's to top the podium this year, which means, if you think about it, more than half of the top CWE lists have included triple Avengers. Although they're not always triplicate squads of 10, some run them in 8s and 9s to free up extra points for cheap trading units, while others run 2 5s, or 2 10s and a 5, excuse me. But most players start with at least one large unit of Avengers in the webway for a CP with the webway strike stratagem. Really what you're doing is you're just maximizing the efficiency of the shooting units in your army, because there's going to be no matchup. It doesn't matter what your opponent's bringing, whether it's Tyranid big bugs or a demon swarm. There's no matchup in which you don't have really optimal shooting against whatever your opponent's brought with pretty much all of your units, right? So in some games, if you're running D cannons or something, there are going to be some games in which the D cannons maybe don't have a great target. There's really no matchup in which everything in a Hail of Doom list doesn't have great targets, and I think that's why it is the most popular current archetype. It's arguably the easiest to pilot well. The other Hail of Doom essential include is at least one large unit of Wind Riders with shuriken cannons, sometimes accompanied by smaller units with shuriken catapults. 9 shuriken cannons on Wind Riders in a Hail list with guide and or against a doomed target can kill just about anything in the game in a single barrage. And now that Fire and Fade is no longer once per turn, the bikes can keep their heads down, right? You can... a big unit of bikes might struggle to battle focus successfully out of line of sight, but with Fire and Fade, you can get them there. So they do devastating damage to the opponent like every turn, and then in the late game, they can help score behind enemy lines or perhaps primary objectives by zipping into your opponent's backfield. The trick to really making this work reliably is to prioritize destroying your opponent's fast attack units early on, such that she doesn't have anything left that's maneuverable enough to actually target the bikes. Among the only matchups in which this ends up being hard are those against Harlequins, Drakari, or mirror matches against other Craftworld lists, all of which tend to have enough depth of speed in their rosters to mess up the bikes early, regardless of what you kill. You can't kill all the stuff that's fast enough to reach the bikes. It's just there's too much fast stuff in elf lists. The other staple unit in Hail lists is the Farseer Skyrunner with Kurnus' bow and Mark of the Incomparable Hunter, a combo that I already made a video about, and which I will link in the video description. The point costs have changed since I made that recording, and 1 or 2 rules. So please don't bother correcting me in the comments. It was made before an FAQ. But for the most part, that video is up to date and can walk you through how to turn your Farseer into a terrifying mortal wound spam machine. One thing that I did not mention in that video, because I had not yet realized it, but has since been pointed out on my patron-only Discord, is that the Farseer with Kurnus' bow and Incomparable Hunter can use the Forewarned stratagem to light up enemy deep strikers with absolutely terrifying efficiency. Like normally we rely on something near the Farseer to do this. You can just have the Farseer do it, which is super cool. Although Avengers and Wind Riders are non-negotiable in 2K Hail lists, there can be significant variation in how Hail lists are rounded out. So most players are including at least 1 unit of Banshees to help with hard-to-reach target elimination and also with behind enemy lines. Many opt for 1 or even 2 units of Shining Spears to perform a similar role and also open up Wrath of Cain as a scoring option. Spears are great for that because they can pick up enemy units in either the shooting phase or the melee phase of the game. Some Hail lists are running Scorpions to help with behind enemy lines on the first turn. I also just love Scorpions as a speed bump and a way of just taking control of the tempo of the game early. I think they're a great move blocker, such a useful unit, but they're finicky. They take some practice. Some Hail lists are even including Shroud Runners, right? Shroud Runners, even though Shroud Runners don't benefit from the sub-faction, but it's usually just 1 unit. They don't benefit from the sub-faction bonus, but they're just so freaking efficiently pointed now and so versatile that they're a valuable addition to almost any list. And the one thing that Shuriken Fire doesn't do is reach 36 inches. So having some early game 36-inch battle focusable fire in a Hail list is useful. Some Hail lists take a troop of Harlequins. It's really hard to pass up traveling players right now since they no longer cost CP. Usually it's just a single Skyweaver with a melee Troop Master. Kegrox Rose is the standard pick, and 5 players. This helps with points efficient target elimination and the trading, sort of mid to late game trading in the opponent's backfield. They also help with behind enemy lines. So it's not all, a Hail list is not just you dump a bunch of Shuriken, you make sure everything in the list is benefiting from the Shuriken bonus. You need to round it out with other units, with melee units, with stuff that can help you do the tactical things that you need to do to also score those secondary objectives. Virtually all Hail of Doom lists are running Bahareth, not all of them, but nearly all of them, just for his durable obsec and the ability to jump into the opponent's backfield in the late game and to score behind enemy lines. And also Bahareth can be really good for scout the enemy, because with his damage gate, you can put him somewhere where he's not gonna die, right? I mean, you might often find that he's better as a combat character, but when you really need to cinch the secondary scoring, he can be great for that. Most Hail lists also include 1 or 2 units of Rangers also to help you max out, scout the enemy, or at least get a good score for it, even if it's not going all the way. If you do decide to build for Hail of Doom, the first thing you probably want to do is take that Farseer Skyrunner with a core of Windriders and Avengers. And after that, you still have almost half the points in your list remaining for those tools that you're personally most fond of to customize it, so you're not just running a clone of something online. You do need to think carefully about exactly how you're going to max out behind enemy lines and consistently score other chosen secondaries, but you can personalize it and still have it be highly competitive, even if you are not yourself some famous elf player that everybody's heard of. Okay. Other Craftworlds list archetypes besides Hail of Doom. And in many respects, everything plays similarly to those Hail lists insofar as they all favor similar secondaries and are also likely to do the majority of their primary scoring in the last 2 turns. The big difference is that other list archetypes favor different tools for inflicting maximum damage on the opponent. These other options can be mostly accounted for with 3 broad list archetype categories. One is full tilt melee lists, another is alpha strike lists, and the last Ynnari lists, which I'll talk about at the end. So one slightly surprising commonality between all non-Hail CWE lists is that the majority of the ones that have made it to the podium in the last 2 months, Ynnari aside, have included the Avatar of Cain as a shockingly durable mid-board bully unit that can be given obsec with Will of Azurian. Pretty cool. After the big nerf to Hail in the I think last summer, when Hail became a one and done secondary, and the rise of Armor of Contempt, the Avatar started creeping into top Craftworlds lists on an increasingly regular basis. It might have been Boone who did it initially. I don't know. I think one of the Goonhammer guys was the first one to be really successful with it. But since Arcs of Omen dropped, the presence of the big bad, definitely not a demon incarnation of Cain has only solidified. The meta has really shifted in a way that makes the Avatar good. Also, a lot of the really strong contender units that we had access to at the very beginning after our codex dropped, a lot of stuff got nerfed. Indirect fire. So some of the things that we might have been leaning into before were sort of nudged aside, and that also made room for the Avatar to be a stronger pick. The trick to using the Avatar well is applying the right psychic buffs and knowing when to commit it and when to hold it back. For one thing, durable as he is, the incarnation of the bloody-handed god has no business poking its head out unless he has the psychic buff Fortune, which eliminates a full third of incoming damage after it has already been halved by the Avatar's molten form. And that's pretty significant damage elimination on a toughness 8 model with a 2-up armor save and a 4-up invuln. So the Avatar, including the Avatar, means you have to have psychic support. The other psychic power that can make a big difference to the Avatar is Quicken, which can make it much more difficult for your opponent to merely outmaneuver or play around the Avatar. You generally want to keep the incarnation of Cain just out of sight in the midboard until it's ready to commit to either hard countering some big enemy threat that comes into the middle of the table, or to rampage into your opponent's backfield after your nippy murder elves have killed the units most capable of countering your big bad elf demon. If you pull this off, you'll not only have tremendous leverage in your opponent's home objectives, but you also have another tool for racking up the points for behind enemy lines. And Quicken can help with that, can help get the Avatar there one turn faster, but because you can't charge after Quicken, you want to make sure that you've softened up anything that's going to be able to target it once it's in the enemy backfield. In many games, it plays the whole game in the midfield, and that's fine. It just depends on what you're up against. The Avatar's absolute reliance on psychic buffs, however, especially Fortune, means that he most commonly shows up in either Ulthwe lists love the Avatar, but if you're not running an Ulthwe list, he most commonly is going to show up alongside other psychic support. So Seer Council for that bonus combined with the Strands of Fate die to make it pretty certain you're going to get Fortune off. That's big. Because he's really good, but the Avatar can be enormously unforgiving in the hands of a less experienced player who might either commit it too early or struggle to position it such that a skilled player can't simply screen it or play around it. It can be a pretty disappointing performance if it's not played with finesse. It's also worth reminding newer players that the Avatar does not benefit from sub-faction bonuses, although that particular not-so-fun fact is in an obscure spot in the Codex. I want to say it's on the page before the data sheets start, kind of like buried, but I'd have to look back to be absolutely sure. Okay, another of the most popular units in every type of non-Hail of Doom top GT list is the D Cannon. I already posted a unit focus video all about D Cannons, but the short version is that they are the most efficiently pointed, high-strength, hard target elimination shooting unit in the entire Craftworld's Codex. And now that they can make use of Fire and Fade multiple times per game, because Fire and Fade had been FAQ'd to be once per game, and now it's back to as many times as you want, they're even more popular, especially in Ulthwe lists, where the Guardian keyword on D Cannons enables your D Cannons to make use of the unique stratagem that offsets the -1 penalty to hit with indirect fire, or just makes them hit on 2s if they're using direct fire. 3 to 6 D Cannons can hugely ease up enemy pressure on the midfield in the early part of the game. And if your cannons survive, they can press forward and punish the enemy's backfield in the latter part of the game. And they have really good synergy with the Avatar of Cain, who helps you control the midfield such that your artillery can press forward. So that's a pretty popular combo in non-Hail lists. I guess the last commonality in between all successful Craftworlds list is that they do rely on a powerful melee presence to push into the opponent's backfield, to pick up units and to strip objectives, and also to help out with behind enemy lines. You don't necessarily need a ton of melee units, but almost all successful Craftworlds lists are going to have at least 2 really good dedicated melee units. Usually these are going to be some combination of Banshees, Scorpions, or Shining Spears, all of which are very good. Okay, let's talk specifically about the first archetype, successful list archetype that's not Hail of Doom, instead of just generalizing about not Hail of Doom lists. And we're going to start with my own personal favorite competitive roster archetype, and that's CWE Full Tilt Melee lists. Although, as I just said, melee units are a Craftworld staple across the board, a true archetypal melee list leans into those close combat units hard and relies on playing into the enemy backfield every turn of the game to keep the opponent on her heels, unable to dictate the flow of play, while you score behind enemy lines and out-trade her for a turn 5 win. These lists don't merely have a couple of units of Banshees and a unit of Scorpions. They usually include at least 6 or 7 dedicated melee units, sometimes more. So while Hail lists rely on the killing power of Shuriken Fire to trade aggressively into the late game, Eldar melee lists do this with a plurality of our top shelf close combat aspect warriors, and sometimes also Harlequin allies, which are, as we've established, pretty great. My very favorite winning roster of all of 9th edition, well, it's like a 4th place roster, but nevertheless, my very favorite, highly competitive, very successful roster of all of 9th edition was Craftworld's Melee list created by Stephen Box. This popped up very recently, and it finished in, as I said, 4th place at this massive GT just a few weeks ago. And I love Stephen's list for two simple reasons. The first is that it's constructed around my own absolute favorite custom Craftworld trait, Vengeful, which gives the whole roster, aside from the avatar, exploding sixes in melee. Vengeful has popped up a couple of times here and there in lists that have done pretty well, usually in smaller GTs, but it's been rare. And the second reason that I love Steven's list is that it's essentially a version of my favorite pseudo-casual list that I've been playing for the entirety of 9th edition that has been bumped and altered to be a competitive list at the highest level. And I am simultaneously delighted by this and also slightly shamed. In addition to the Avatar of Cain, which I mentioned earlier, appears in many of these lists, Steven's roster contains double Banshees, triple Scorpions, one of which is a 10 elf unit. I would not have thought that 20 Scorpions was the way forward, but it totally works. 2 units of Shining Spears, a melee autarch with Falchu's Wing, and the Warlord trait Ambush of Blades and a Banshee Mask. Ambush of Blades is used to offset the low AP on the striking Scorpions. It can increase the AP of a nearby melee unit by 1. And best of all, Jane Heckenzar, whom I really did not think was a candidate for serious competitive play before this, and in the hands of most players simply isn't. But in this very specific list, she provides a source of fast, durable obsec that can strip primary points from an opponent by jumping on an objective with something that's not obsec, as well as providing a 4th unit on top of the 2 Banshees and the Autarch with the Banshee Mask that has a fight last ability, which enables Steven, he has to parcel out those fight last units carefully, but he can just flood his opponent with wave after wave after wave of uninterruptible melee brutality. If he's charging with a couple things every turn, two or three things every turn, and activating the Banshees last, he can be sure that his melee can't be interrupted with the 2-point stratagem. So that's a really smart play. Another surprising twist is Steven's off-meta pick for the second custom Craftworld trait. He selected Children of Cain, which adds +1 to the damage in melee on unmodified 6s to wound. I don't think I've ever seen Children of Cain in a high-performing list, and before Steven, I frankly didn't think that it was a contender for top-table play. But what it does in this particular build is transform every squad of Banshees and Scorpions into a serious threat, even to the most durable targets, kind of like that Shuriken Fire in a Hail list can use something like Guide to reroll into T8 stuff and auto-wound it. In Steven's list, Children of Cain stacks with Vengeful, enabling units of Banshees and Scorpions to push through an extra 3 or 4, sometimes even more wounds on stuff that would otherwise be a little bit above their pay grade. So Banshees get +1 to wound on the charge anyway, so even T8 stuff they're wounding on 5s. But if all of their 6s to wound, and that's going to be half of the wounds, are doing 3 damage instead of 2 on the Exarch, or 2 damage instead of 1, because the Exarch with Piercing Strike, of course. On the regular Banshees, that's really going to hurt. And so this is how Steven's list has that extra damage output necessary that I was talking about earlier to really mess up your opponent such that in the last 2 turns of the game, you're winning on primaries in addition to maxing out most of your secondaries, mostly. The only significant shooting in Steven's whole list is a couple of relatively cheap heavy support. Well, I guess they're not cheap. He's got 3 D cannons, which, along with the Avatar, keep the enemy from moving into the midfield and blocking that melee pressure. And then in the late game, those D cannons can help put pressure on the backfield. And then he's also got 3 Warwalkers with 6 scatter lasers between them, and they can fire and fade and control a backfield objective, and also pick up screening units so that his 9 dedicated melee units can get where they need to be on the opponent's end of the table. This is just an enormously clever and potent combination. The one thing that I don't fully grok about Steven's roster is how, with neither transports nor ghost walk, he is successfully maneuvering the Banshees and Scorpions into position when he doesn't get first turn. All of my own melee full tilt lists include at least Falcons or a Wave Serpent or something. So I'm hoping that we can get Steven on the channel to talk it over with us, because I'd love to hear more about how he's playing it. Regardless of whether you personally own 20 Scorpions, if you have enough dedicated melee units, you can absolutely run a high-pressure melee trading list with a serious competitive edge. Like Steven, you need to plan for how you will max out your score for behind enemy lines. And also, like Steven, you might want to bring along a single unit of Rangers. He did that. I didn't mention it, for Scout the Enemy. But ultimately, what is most important is that you have the tools to disassemble every type of obstacle you might encounter in order to outscore your opponent on primaries in the last 2 turns of the game. You might consider running some Twilight Traveling players to round out your melee threats, or maybe you toss in a unit of Warp Spiders with Web of Deceit to help with behind enemy lines, and that Relic of the Shrines upgrade on the Exarch's Murder Blades. I don't actually remember what that sergeant level relic is called, but it basically makes your Exarch a melee presence, and that can also really help with Wrath of Cain. Full tilt melee lists are definitely more difficult to pull off than Hail of Doom, but when done well, they can get really solid results even in the most competitive 40k. Okay. Let's talk Craftworld's Alpha Strike. A third fast and furious Eldari archetype that has been racking up prestigious wins is what I think of as Craftworld's Alpha Strike lists. So an Alpha Strike list relies on an opening gambit that is so hard-hitting that even though that early play probably involves trading maybe even as much as a third of your army in the first turn of the game, the initial assault, or maybe second turn, the initial assault does so much damage to the opponent that she's never able to catch up, and then just doesn't have enough tools left to outtrade or outscore you. As we've already established, all of the top-performing Craftworlds lists these days make use of the same narrow band of secondaries and score primaries in a similar way. Frankly, also, both Hail of Doom and Full Tilt melee lists can be run in most builds as Alpha Strike. But a dedicated Alpha Strike list relies on different tools and generally wants to be able to do this in pretty much every matchup. One popular option in recent months has been lists with 3 Falcons full of Dire Avengers and Banshees that can jump out on turn 1, perhaps with some special characters taking up the 6th slot in those transports, and maybe also a unit of Scorpions. This approach, the Tri-Falcon approach, can work well with a variety of sub-faction picks, but Ulthwe is definitely one of them. I actually suspect that this would be possible to do with Beltan, the perennial, almost competitive Craftworld of 9th edition. Nobody's done it yet on a top table at a GT, but I think it would be at least possible. You Beltan enthusiasts might be a good goal. The other option for Alpha Strike that has been getting a little play is the Swift Strikers / Masterful Shots custom combo with a big unit of Shuriken Cannon Wind Riders that can zip out 22 inches, get an angle on something turn 1, fire their heavy weapons at no penalty, and then battle focus or fire and fade to safety despite having used heavy weapons, because Swift Strikers, that unit, which was previously only really appearing in Hail lists, is popular in Swift Striker lists now, and it's, I think, kind of replaced the Swooping Hawk spam that was previously the anchor of Swift Striker lists, since those went up 25% point cost. The ability to advance and then fire, even with heavy weapons and battle focus, though, such a powerful tool for Alpha Strike, so really, really good on Wind Riders. It's also not surprising that Shroud Runners, because of their pregame move and their 16-inch range, are pretty popular Swift Strikers option, or just Alpha Strike option in general. So if you do want to construct an Alpha Strike list, there are a lot of ways to do it, but what you need to think about is how you can reliably make a large-scale early-game trade that will almost invariably leave your opponent disadvantaged, perhaps like a disposable 500 points of your army for 650 points of units critical to your opponent's battle plan. And that can be so emotionally satisfying. As powerful, though, as Alpha Strike lists can be, they can also be painfully unforgiving, because the player piloting them needs to be able to look at an enemy army and infer which units are essential to the opponent's plan. And that kind of precision target priority requires wide knowledge of a variety of factions and builds, and sufficiently comprehensive knowledge of one's own units to really not have to devote any mental energy to remembering how to use one's own assets. And that's a really tall order for new players outside of their own local meta. So Alpha Strike, really good, hard for new players. All right. The last significant competitive Craftworlds archetype that we've been seeing on top tables at GTs is Ynnari, which are essentially a Craftworlds subfaction in 9th edition, the way the rules work. In many respects, Ynnari simply combine elements of all the other Craftworld builds to play hard into the opponent's backfield and then out-trade them. Nevertheless, Ynnari bring to the table some unique tools that present new ways of achieving these goals. And first and foremost among those is the Incarn, the big bad incarnation of the Eldar god of death that can instantly teleport to anywhere a unit has been destroyed. The sheer insane mobility of the Incarn makes it a tremendous tool for maxing out behind enemy lines and putting the hurt on your opponent's hardest to reach critical units. And although it isn't as durable as the Avatar of Cain and doesn't have access to Fortune for a further boost, the Incarn makes up for that shortcoming with its tricky teleportation power and 2 psychic casts. Also, having the Incarn in your list seriously burdens your opponent's decision making because opponents need to decide whether to kill the fast, fragile unit that you dump into their backfield on turn 1, knowing that if they do, it might immediately be replaced by the God of Death, which requires mentally taxing calculations on your opponent's part, and that has its own tactical value. The more hard choices you force your opponent to make, the more likely they are to make play errors, especially in the late game. And the Incarn, therefore, I think is arguably the most definitive tool available to Ynnari. If you're gonna bother running Ynnari, you want the Incarn. Most Ynnari lists, though, also feature an above-average amount of psychic mortal wound spam, despite not having access to Executioner. The Revenant Discipline offers some powerful Witchfire options on top of Smite and Crushing Orb, and additional powers can be brought to bear by the Harlequin Shadowseer, who appears in most rosters. Some lists also make use of the Ynnari psychic abilities that enhance melee damage, or a Shield of Ynned, which lets you drop a 4-up invuln save on just about anything. That's really good. Nevertheless, those are far less common than Witchfire spam, which is a near universal quality of a successful Death Elf list. The other tool that distinguishes Ynnari rosters from their Craftworld cousins is access to Harlequin and Drakara units run as Ynnari. Although that said, since the nerf to Harlequin saving throws, they're all 5-up now instead of 4-up, and with the introduction of free Harlequin patrols that retain their own intact subfaction bonuses, access to those additional list building options is really no longer as significant an advantage for Ynnari as it once was. Aside from that Harlequin Shadowseer that I already mentioned, the only really standard pick is a single unit of Cabalites for cheap OBSEC, and that isn't like wildly earth-shaking or anything. Some Ynnari players run a single unit of disposable Reavers to the Drakari bikes to grab behind enemy lines on turn 1. That's great. Reavers are cheap. They can be even faster than Wind Riders. And there are definitely other units with potential. Hellions I have some potential, but ultimately few Drakari units make it into Ynnari lists because there's usually a Craftworld's equivalent that actually does the job better, as Drakari Ynnari have the inherent disadvantage of being pointed for access to a faction bonus that they lose, Power from Pain, while not gaining access to Strands of Fate or Battle Focus. The most interesting, highly successful Ynnari list that I've come across recently is, of all things, largely a shooting list, accompanied by a small patrol of actual Harlequins, including a Troopmaster with Kegarax Rose rather than Ynnari Harlequins. It features 6 D-cannon support platforms to brutalize the midfield and push up to threaten the opponent's backfield, as well as Dire Avengers, Shroud Runners, and delightfully, a unit of Shadow Specters, a Forge World unit, that can pop in from Deep Strike and put down some real hurt. The Incarn in the standard package of Mortal Wound Spam still apply, but this nevertheless remains an innovative list. It's kind of a unique approach, and it comes from my own personal favorite acolyte of Yvraine, Chase Chappelle, who is also the author of the Ynnari Alpha Strike list that I featured back during this summer. Chase has been coming up with creative and effective ways to play Death Elves at a high level since the 9th edition Codex dropped, and you can find this 3rd place GT list over on Goonhammer's MetaWatch article from March 1st, if you want to get some ideas for a unique Ynnari build. To sum up, if you are going to give competitive Ynnari a whirl, the Incarn is an auto-include, and it's probably also worth adding enough Mortal Wound Psychic spam that your army can do real damage in the Psychic phase as well as in shooting and melee. As with all competitive lists, you need to think about scoring, or at least all Eldari competitive lists, you need to think about scoring behind enemy lines every turn of the game, as well as either scout the enemy or banners, probably with the capacity to max out Warp Ritual if you need to, and if not, a kill-based secondary objective might be the move. Like Chase, you will probably be the most successful with Ynnari if you don't get caught up in thinking about how to maximize the effectiveness of the Ynnari sub-faction bonus, which is not one of their greatest assets. It's good. The fight first thing is good, but it's not. There are better reasons, like the Incarn and the psychic powers, to play Ynnari. Overly focusing on how you're going to include Drakari or Ynnari Harlequins also is probably a mistake. Neither the sub-faction bonus nor the sexy list building options are Death Elves' greatest advantages. Frankly, both of those can be traps in competitive play, as leaning into either is likely to result in a less optimal list that isn't finely tuned enough for top tables. I think what makes Chase so good as a player and a tactician is his ability to look past the patterns that immediately suggest themselves and see what will really be the most effective, while still remaining aesthetically devoted to Ynnari, come what may rules-wise. He's been very loyal to them, but in all of his lists, he's overlooked the way that the codex in the game kind of implicitly suggests that you build Ynnari, and instead he's been able to see what kinds of opportunities really exist. So that's it in a nutshell. A really fine-tuned Craftworld's list from any of these archetypes in the twilight months of 9th edition. All of those lists are going to have in common a narrow band of secondaries and a hyper-aggressive playstyle that revolves around punching into the opponent's backfield and picking up what they have on the table to shore up primary objective scoring in the last 2 turns. There have been lists that deviate from this a little. There was a real weird outlier list that I liked that had 2 Wraith Lords and an Avatar of Cain with Fortune and Will of Azurian, so the player could pivot into using the Wraith Lords as like mini avatars to play a durability game in the midfield. But really, for the most part, and even that list put pressure on the opponent's backfield. For the most part, this one overall play style is really what is working for Craftworlds, and I think the thing to aim at if you do have an eye towards competitive success. But there are a lot of ways to achieve that result, right? Hail of Doom is the most popular and arguably the easiest. A full tilt melee list or an Alpha Strike list or a Ynnari roster, all of those also have a proven track record at top tables. And although I'm not suggesting that anyone listening to this video should prioritize competitive play, nevertheless, knowing what's working for top tournament players at the top tables can help, I think, even the most casual player make more informed decisions about how they want to balance units and secondaries that are selected for narrative or aesthetic reasons against having a roster and a battle plan with enough teeth to not just get rolled. Like casual games, you still want them to be not foregone conclusions and fun to play. And if your list doesn't have enough teeth to be a contender, it can be hard to have a good time. So that's what I've got. If you liked this video, I hope that you will consider clicking like and maybe leaving a comment below. If you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you will consider clicking subscribe. I have a slightly quixotic personal goal of maybe hitting 10,000 subscribers before 10th edition drops later this year, so I would definitely appreciate anything that you can do to help me get there. If you are interested in joining the private Discord for this channel, obtaining early access to most content, and being able to consume all of it or much of it as a downloadable podcast, I hope you might consider becoming a patron. I will link the video in the video description details for how to do that. Until next time, best wishes with your pointy ears and good luck in your next campaign.